Now, I thought I would end this course with a bit of a side hustle for the R5C, which is VR. Now, it's kind of getting itself a bit of a reputation for being the camera to use, particularly for 180 VR, because of the dual fisheye lens that Canon fairly recently brought out, and is certainly still quite hard to get hold of. The dual fisheye lens is a single lens which attaches to the body and captures two circular images simultaneously to the file. The camera itself doesn't know any different. It doesn't need to be told that it's using that lens. It just simply, you stick the lens on and it records. And because you can record in 8K on this camera, that means by the time you've taken those two spherical images and spread them out and sent them to each eye and painted them across a 180-degree canvas, you actually end up with still a very good looking rendering of the scene that is really important with VR, because you're trying to make people feel like they're there. And so if they're looking around and looking at something that looks noticeably lower quality and more highly compressed than they would see with their eyes, it's just a constant reminder that they're not looking at anything that mimics reality. So by shooting in 8K and then essentially splitting that between each eye, so 4K per eye, and then spread out, you ultimately can end up with a very good quality HD 180-degree canvas, which is very convincing and compelling to look at on a headset. So what I wanted to talk about is the kind of workflow with that, and things to bear in mind when you're shooting VR with the 180 setup, so with the dual fisheye lenses, and then also I'll spin around and I'll take you through the post-production workflow for that as well, in order to deliver to an Oculus headset or whatever it might be. When you're shooting with the dual fisheye lens, one of the most important things you need to be mindful of is that it is obviously a fisheye lens. So you have an extreme wide angle field of view. Now that means that you have to be very mindful of what's going on beneath the camera. So tripods, or whether it's your feet or whatever it might be, they're going to probably be in view unless you take steps to rule them out. And those types of steps, include mounting the camera on an extendable boom arm and getting it away from the tripod so that it doesn't see the legs. It has to be quite far in front of those feet of the tripod to be able to cut them out of the frame. Or if you're holding it on a gimbal, to have your arms out far enough so that your feet aren't in it, which is very hard to do. The other thing to bear in mind in terms of positioning the camera is not just that it's far enough away so that you can't see what it's mounted on, and that enables you to feel like you're actually in this free floating space and not like, oh, I'm anchored with these tripod legs, whatever it might be. Not only do you have to be mindful of that, you also have to be mindful of the height of the camera. So for example, if you were mounting it on a gimbal, which is great for creating nice smooth movement forwards or backwards or sideways or wherever, you have to be careful that the height of the camera, if you're trying to make it feel like the person is where the camera is that it's an average head height. So for example, it's very hard to hold a gimbal with the camera and the lens and everything on it for too long up high. If you've ever done it, you know how much stress that puts on your back muscles. We tend to kind of lower and use our elbows to support that. But if you do that with the dual fisheye lens, you'll end up with something that's kind of at navel height or chest height. And if the person viewing that is meant to be believing that they're stood in this environment, but it's down at where their chest or their navel would be, it's going to look odd. So although you can't predict the height of the viewer, you can certainly try and keep it an average kind of 5'10" ish kind of height, and try and make it so for the majority of people it feels that it's at the normal height for them when they're either moving with a gimbal through, or even if it's static, just that height is quite crucial. So keep your tripod legs or your own feet out of the shot. Try and think about the height of the camera so that it makes the viewer feel like it's actually them there present. You also need to be really mindful of the level, because if it's off kilter in any way, then that viewer is going to be feeling like they're walking around with their head lopsided the whole time. So you have to use a little level, a little vertical and horizontal level to make sure that it is completely level all the time. That really helps. And then the final tip in terms of production is to be very careful about how you move the camera. You cannot be panning or tilting around. You will make your viewer sick. It is very, very difficult to pull off any kind of camera movement without making the viewer feel disoriented and therefore sick. So if you're going to move the camera, keep it very simple, straight ahead, straight back, great for walk and talks. If you're going to pan the camera, you need to do that ever so slowly. The other thing to bear in mind is if you're hand holding it, is that you're not sort of entering somewhere. So I had a situation where we were entering a space and then we were doing a VR tour essentially of this space down the length of it, but the steps into the space were here and then you turn and went that way. So we have to essentially just dissolve from that move up the steps to then the move down, because if you actually took the viewer with you around the corner, they would be feeling like they were very, very seasick. So you have to be mindful of how you then cut that together, which I'll talk a bit more about when we get to the post-production bit. So in terms of operationally, it's very restricted actually in terms of what you can do with the camera and movement. But of course the payoff is that ultimately you end up with something that's ultra realistic and vivid and makes someone feel like they're completely immersed. Another thing to think about with the production side of things is that when you're sticking this dual fisheye lens on the camera, you are seeing on the back of the camera two circular extreme fisheye images. So it makes your usual kind of tools, your waveform monitor, makes a lot of that almost impossible to use. So what I've found is you need to ideally just use another lens with a similar f-stop to try and judge your exposure and then swap it at the last minute to the dual fisheye lens. But also in terms of focus as well, you're often very stepped down so that it's very deep depth of field so that you don't have to worry too much. But you can use focus peaking, but it ends up being sort of just a big mess. So what I found is the best thing to do is actually use the magnification button. So the magnification button on the back of the camera will punch in digitally onto the image and enable you to essentially punch in to one of the circles and use that to then have a look around, check your composition, check focus, things like that. Because when you're fully zoomed out and you're seeing the two circular images on the back, it's way too small and busy and there's so much going on in it you can't really easily tell. So that magnification button becomes very useful for making sure everything is right before you hit record. Now let's have a little look at what we can do once we've shot some VR footage with the dual fisheye lens on the R5C in post-production, and how we would develop that, how we would convert it to something that can then be put onto a headset, and things we need to be mindful of in terms of export settings as well to make sure that we get the highest quality image at the very end.
Right, well, first things first then, let's get the Canon VR plugin installed. There's actually two different approaches to this. There's the Canon VR Utility, which is Canon's own software that will enable you to process the footage that's captured using the dual fisheye lens. But then there's also a plugin available for Adobe Premiere Pro. The VR Utility from Canon doesn't currently work, as of recording this, with Apple Silicon Macs. I'm using a Mac Studio here, so it has that Apple M1 Silicon in it, and therefore I can't install and show you that utility working. The Premiere plugin actually is also a separate issue for me because I don't actually use Premiere. So I typically use Resolve or Final Cut Pro 10. But just for the sake of processing the footage and showing you what you can do with it, I'm going to go through the steps using Premiere's plugin from Canon for the VR plugin. So let's start off by opening up Safari here, and I'm at the, well, in this case, canon.co.uk, but of course, whichever local version of the site that you use will be fine, because I've come to the ProPhoto Professional Video Solutions EOS VR System VR Utility Adobe Premiere Pro plugin. Look at that for a URL. Just Google it. So this page here will enable me to either download the EOS VR Utility or download the EOS VR plugin for Adobe Premiere Pro, which is the one that I need. So I'm going to click on there, click download. that takes you to probably a familiar page if you are an owner of a Canon camera. These support pages where you can download drivers, software, manuals, various different bits and pieces, firmware for the cameras. In this software section, this actually comes under the EOS R5, but obviously that will still work. EOS VR plugin for Adobe Premiere Pro. Select your operating system. I've lost track of what we're on these days. What am I on? Monterey 12.4. I don't think it goes that high. Monterey. No, it doesn't actually go above macOS 11. It actually doesn't matter which version of the macOS that I choose in here. It's going to show the correct EOS VR plugin anyway. And here it is, EOS VR plugin 1.1 for Adobe Premiere Pro macOS, released in February this year. Let's download this. Agree to that license agreement. Let's go and find that DMG. Double click the installer. Where are we? We're in Europe. Do I really need to tell you exactly where I am? Okay, United Kingdom. Start installing the plugin. Yep. Type in my password. And job done. Quite out of that. So it doesn't take long to install. Obviously, the plugin is now ready to use inside Premiere. So I'm going to launch Premiere. Let's come to my Creative Cloud and video. Before we go any further, I should point out a few gotchas with this. Both Canon's VR utility software, but also the plugin, the VR plugin for Premiere Pro, neither of them work properly on Apple Silicon at the moment. They've been out since February this year, so it's taking a while, and I do hope that Canon hurry up and update these plugins and the utility itself so that they support the latest Apple computers, but currently they don't. The VR utility, that essentially means that you can't use it at all. I've been unable to install it and get it to work at all on my Mac. The VR plugin for Adobe Premiere Pro does work, but you do need to make sure that Adobe Premiere Pro, the app, is set to open in Rosetta. Now you do that by simply going to the applications folder, finding the app, right-clicking and getting info, and then just ticking the open in Rosetta box. That will force the application to go through Apple's code translation software, essentially, that is designed to make Intel-only apps run on Apple Silicon. Now, Premiere Pro isn't an Intel-only app, and it shouldn't need this on, but evidently the plugin is. And so when you have that switched off, although Premiere runs absolutely fine, and in fact is very quick on the Mac Studio, that plugin, and in fact any plugin that you might have that doesn't work on a non-Intel chip, will then not open up. It literally does nothing, and it can appear as if the plugin that you've just installed isn't doing anything. And it isn't really, it's because it hasn't loaded it. So by forcing the Premiere app to open up in Rosetta, you are unfortunately taking a penalty, because the whole code of the software, and it is a mammoth piece of coding involved in the Premiere app, is then having to be translated on the fly, and it slows the performance down quite a bit. However, it does then mean that the VR plugin works correctly and does what it's meant to do. So that's a pain. There's also a few additional things. So I found that I needed to enter the serial number of my R5C into Canon support pages and download a HEVC or HEVC activator piece of software. The HEVC files play back absolutely fine on my Mac, and I've never needed to install that before, but apparently according to Canon, you do have to have that activator piece of software installed for the VR plugin to work with any MP4 files that you import using the dual fisheye lens that were recorded into HEVC, which is what I did and what I typically do. So you have to have that activator installed, and for that to work, you need the serial number of your camera. So that's a bit of a pain. And probably the worst one of all, actually, is that you can use this VR plugin for free, with no penalty, fully functional version of that plugin, as long as the clips that you're converting are under 2 minutes. Now that's actually fine. In this example, the demo clip I'm going to use is only a minute long. But if you do need to work with the VR plugin for clips that are beyond that 2-minute duration, then you have to pay either an annual or a monthly subscription, and set up a Canon ID, and through their website essentially subscribe to that as a service, which I think is annoying, but I guess it's aimed at the fact that people who might be using this VR plugin are probably doing it for commercial reasons. We're not quite at the point now where people are just willy-nilly creating VR content for consumption at home, but I think it will definitely come. At the moment, I guess Canon's thinking is this is probably a commercial workflow, and as such, they don't feel like it's necessarily going to dissuade someone by making them pay either a monthly or an annual subscription, which is what I've had to do. In fact, you get a 31-day free trial, so you can try this out for yourself and then just cancel the subscription afterwards if you want to. But those are some things that are needed in order for this workflow to work. So you need the VR plugin downloaded and installed from Canon's website. You need the HEVC activator downloaded and installed and registered with the serial number. You need a Canon ID set up on Canon's website, which you do through their support pages. And you need to purchase a subscription. Even if you intend to cancel it and just use it as a free trial, you still need to create it. I think it's something like £5 a month, and it would probably be cheaper if you do that annually. And then finally, as I said at the start, you need to make sure that Premiere is opening in Rosetta for this all to come together. Not the best workflow, I think you'll agree, but hopefully certainly a lot of the problems will go away as soon as Canon update this plugin to work with Apple Silicon, and some of the other kind of workflow things, who knows, maybe that'll change over time. But for now, that's what's necessary for this to all work. So let's open up Premiere, which, as I said, is now running in Rosetta, so it is running really slowly, unfortunately. And I'm going to show you how this works. And once you've done all those things I've just mentioned, it is actually very straightforward. I've got a new project set up here in Premiere. I'm just going to double-click in the project window to bring up an import window. Here's a demo clip that I've shot, and I'm going to hit import. Now what you'll discover is as soon as I double click that to load it up into the source viewer, you can see in the source window it's already done automatically the equirectangular correction, which is what takes it from 2 circles to 2 squares, which are spread out for each eye. And in the effect controls, I can see the plugin working. It's automatically applied some parallax correction. There is the option to do a horizontal correction as well, and both of these things will slightly distort and warp the image to correct for the extreme fisheye nature of the lens. Very similar to what you'd find if you were doing any kind of lens correction in, for example, Adobe Lightroom or something like that. It's essentially the same thing. Beneath that, we've got options to account for any kind of pan or tilt, so pan left and right, tilt up and down, and roll. So we can also adjust if you didn't take my advice and use a spirit level on the top of your camera when you were shooting, and it wasn't exactly level, then you can correct that to a certain extent. You can adjust the pan to plus and minus 5, tilt, and roll. And that makes a small difference. Obviously, there's not a huge amount of correction there because you've recorded such a huge field of view. There's only so much that you can do with that before it would become obviously manipulated. And so this, again, just demonstrates why I said that it's so important that you get the camera level using some kind of assistance, even just, as I say, these small little spirit levels that will show you your X and Y level. During recording, that will make sure that you don't need to employ these controls in the effect controls, and hopefully it just looks correct straight away as soon as you import it. If I grab this clip, I'm just going to drag it down here to create a new sequence. Let's just rename this sequence VR demo. And if I play through this, you can see it's very, very slow. Unfortunately, it actually, before I forced Premiere to open up in Rosetta, it was playing through this 8K HEVC clip perfectly happily in real time on the Mac Studio, and now it's taking a good sort of 6-7 seconds to even then update the viewer. So it's obviously not a particularly useful workflow right now, but given that all we're trying to do is convert these clips, because once they're converted and the equirectangular correction is done and we've correctly mapped it to a 180-degree sphere for left and right eye, which I'll show you next, then we can just get it out. As long as we can get it out, we then don't need to rely on that plugin to do any further work, and we can essentially then bring those files back in and do the editing if we want to, or just go straight out to a headset or whatever you're trying to do with it. So now I've got this clip in. I would obviously normally top and tail it, but as I said, it's running so slowly that I'm not going to bother doing that right now. One tip I would suggest that you customize in your viewer, if you click the little button editor in the bottom right, it is definitely worth adding on the toggle VR video display option. Just drag it down and plop it in your button bar down there, and that enables you to turn on a recreation, essentially, so I can now click and move through, and this allows me to preview what it is that my end user is going to see when they're looking around in their headset. So it's a very useful button to have added on so that you can click in and just check whenever the need arises. So this is all looking good to me. Now your sequence settings should be automatically correct. You would have noticed I dragged the clip down onto the new item option in the project window. By doing that, it should automatically set the new sequence to match the clip that I dragged onto it. But just to double check, I can either right click on the sequence and I can look at its sequence settings that way, or I can go up to the main menu and open up my sequence settings there. And I just want to double check that everything looks correct. It's 25 frames, that's correct. You can see it's the 8K frame size, so 8,192 pixels wide by 4,096 pixels high. Rec 709, progressive, square pixels, all looks good. And then right at the bottom here, we've got our VR properties. And you can see it's automatically set up the projection for equirectangular, which is what we want. The layout is stereoscopic side by side, one for the left eye, one for the right eye, that's correct. And then we have a 180 degrees set up for the horizontal and vertical view, which again is correct. So that's all normal, that's what it should be set to. But just in case you created your sequence manually, just make sure that those settings are what you see. Okay, I'm just going to turn off my VR video display preview for a second, and just going to quickly go over some of the built-in effects that you can use when you're working with VR. The first of which is an effect that will enable me to place graphics or video or other layers within the spherical image of the VR. So it's very good for adding titles, or in this case I'm going to add a company logo, which is going to pop up at the beginning. So if I double click down here, I'm just going to go and grab a logo that I've got here, which I'm going to bring in, and I'm just going to place that logo on a layer on top of my video. Now that layer, obviously, if I did nothing with it, would just be flat over the top of it and would just interfere with the vision. It certainly doesn't integrate it with what's going. I can see that if I go to my preview, you can see it just looks bizarre there. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to select it, and I'm going to come to my effects tab, and within my video effects, immersive video category, I have my VR plane to sphere effect. I'm going to drop that onto my logo, and you can see how that moves that. Instantly that's transported that, and if I go back to my VR view, you can see how that gets centered and is integrated in. So as someone is viewing this within their headset, as they move, the logo would stay fixed in that physical position. Now I can adjust certain elements of this. If I go to my effect controls for that clip, you can see the VR plane to sphere effect is down here. If I turn it off and on, you can see it doing what it's meant to do. There are various options to do with scale, so I'm actually going to scale this down. In fact, let's set it to about 30, so it's smaller within the frame. There's a stereo disparity, which enables me to shift it off up to 45 degrees to one eye. I have some feather controls, though I don't see why I'd want to use those. I also have some rotate source. So if for some reason this graphic didn't feel like it sort of integrated nicely, I can actually adjust the tilt, pan and roll, the rotation of that source. So you can see here I can rotate my logo there, and I can move it around. Of course, these can all be animated as well. So if I wanted to, I could actually animate this as a way of getting this logo on and off screen, for example. And then there's the rotate projection, which rather than the rotate source, which keeps essentially it physically static within the environment, and you're just altering the source file, the logo, the rotate projection options do the same, but it will move it around. So if I move the projection pan, for example, I can actually move where it's appearing within the field of view. So if I move it to one side, then as I turn my head, it will look like it's fixed in that position. So for example, I could have little animated logos for each of the different shops that are along this street. As the camera moves down them, I could have them pop on and appear to be fixed to one side or the other as you're moving the head around. It could be quite a nice way to introduce the different retailers that are based on this street. Who knows? There's various different reasons why you might want to use these controls, but they are all in the effect controls under the VR plane to sphere controls at the top here. Now, there are also, if I close the video effects and go to the video transitions, there is an immersive video category there too. You know, they're all pretty gross. Probably the least objectionable one would be the VR spherical blur. If I add that to the head of my graphic, that will fade on that graphic as it appears on the screen. So okay, so we've seen what we have to do to get this stuff in, and the settings we have to set or check, because a lot of it it's done for you, which is very useful. The options available to you in the effect controls, and the various different effects, both in terms of transitions and video effects for mapping graphics or other layers within your immersive video. That's pretty much all there is to think about in terms of tools that are directly within Premiere that relate to VR. Of course, there's all of your normal tools. You can just treat it like any other video layer. So for example, if I wanted to do some color grading, there's no reason I can't come and get my Lumetri color effect and plop that on. This was shot Canon Log 3, so it does need color grading. So I can use all of my normal color grading tools to do that. I'll just do that very quickly. So I'm going to go back to my workspace for editing, and it's time to export this. So go up to the export section. The first thing that we're going to look at is if we're creating something to send to something like an Oculus headset, where we want the best quality settings, but we also need to make sure that it understands that this is VR. The recommendations that I'm going to make here are actually based on Canon's own recommendations in their own support documentation in terms of outputting. So these are liable to change, or you might find that you need some slightly different ones, maybe a different data rate, but I'm just going to show you what Canon currently recommend and what I find works well. So I'm going to first of all make sure that this is 8K, and therefore it needs to be an HEVC. You can't actually export as 8K and H.264. So I'm going to go to H.265 HEVC, and we're not going to use any kind of preset. We don't need to worry about these. We're just going to go into the video section. We should confirm that it is matched to the source. It's the 8K 25 frames. If I click on more, I can get access to the actual data rate settings. Now, by default, it's set to the main profile. H.264 and H.265 have different profiles they can use. They refer to it as tier in Premiere. So we need to change that from main to high, and what that does is that enables me to actually adjust the bit rate, the target bit rate. It's preset to 35 megabits per second, and as I said, Canon's recommendation is 100 megabits per second, which does justice to the nature of the resolution of it. You need to up that data rate. And that's it. So we're H.265, we're 100 megabits per second in the high encoding profile. The bitrate encoding is variable bitrate with one pass. If you wanted to, you could set that to a constant bitrate and you would then get a consistent level across the whole piece. The only problem is that you might find some hardware might struggle with that. Okay, so it depends on the age of the hardware that you're going to be viewing this on. If you want to be certain that it's going to work, then I would leave it as a variable bitrate rather than the constant bitrate, and just make sure that it's targeting 100. So now that we've set this to 100 megabits per second, it's really important, just a couple of options down from here, that we select the VR is video checkbox. By checking that, we get to confirm the frame layout. Now, you would have thought that Premiere would automatically take this information from the sequence settings and flow it through, but it doesn't. So it's defaulted to monoscopic instead of stereoscopic left and right. So we do need to make sure that the frame layout is set to stereoscopic side by side. And again, we want to update our horizontal and vertical field of view, making sure that they're both set to 180. And then we can just go ahead and hit export. Now you can see it's giving me an estimate of nearly 15 minutes there to render this out, and it will take a long time. It's an 8K file, there's a lot of pixels for it to encode. Obviously also mine is taking even longer because it's running through Rosetta at the moment in order to work. I'm just going to cancel that. And I'm going to go back up to the export menu, and in case you want to export out to YouTube, which you can do, YouTube supports VR 180 videos. You can pan using your mouse and you can look around in them. If I want to do that, like any time that I'm exporting to YouTube, in fact, I want to give it as higher quality as possible because, of course, YouTube will do its own encoding at the back end. As soon as it's up, it will start generating different versions of it. And as such, my view is always give it as higher quality as you possibly can, and just kind of accept that you're going to have to output a very large file. It's going to take a long time to upload, it's going to take a long time to process, but all of the different versions that YouTube are then going to create are going to look the best they can. So as such, I'm going to go to my format, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom and choose QuickTime. And I'm going to use Apple ProRes 422HQ, which I realize is huge, but as I said, I want to give it as higher quality output as possible so that YouTube is then creating its encoded versions from my high quality master. I'm then going to scroll down. You should see that the 8K and 25 frames are the key bits of information that are already set correctly. If I go down into my bottom of my settings, I'll find the VR video option again. So video is VR, and again, it doesn't come through, which is annoying. So I do have to make sure that I remember to set that to 180 side-by-side stereoscopic, and then I can go ahead and export that, and that will now go ahead and export that file. I can then upload that to YouTube, or of course I might want to use Premiere's built-in YouTube integration, in which case it can render out and then upload it when it's ready, which if I'm leaving it going overnight, for example, might be useful. And I think actually, although this was just a demo shot, walking down this high street like this, it gives people an opportunity to see in great detail and sort of get an immersive sense of what it's like to walk down, in this case, Cheap Street in Frome, with its little miniature river that runs down the middle of it. So I hope you found that these tips have been useful if you are planning on experimenting with the dual fisheye lens. As for the course at large, that brings us to a close. Thank you so much for joining me for this video guide with the R5C. I hope you've picked up some tips, and I really hope the acid test here is that if you pick up an R5C for the first time after watching this course, that you can get shooting very, very quickly, and you know your way around the menus and how to find the key settings in those menus almost straight away. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me.